Hi and welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for joining this tech session on accessibility. I'm an iOS developer, so this will be from an iOS perspective. I'm currently working at Untitled Lab, where we're working to implement accessibility in our app. Accessibility is a big topic and there's always place for improvement, but I'll be sharing with you some of the things that we learned on the way, and maybe this can be useful to you. So what we'll cover today: what is accessibility and why it matters, what exists on iOS to implement and enable accessibility features for users, which development tools can be used on the platform, and we'll finish with some examples of usage on iOS. Of course, not everything will be covered. This is a quick session, but my goal is to give you a sneak peek of what is possible, and most importantly, talk about it and bring this topic to light, because the more people have knowledge of this, the more it can be implemented in apps. Let's see a visual example of what accessibility can be first. So here you have the calendar app with some meetings in it. So something that exists on iOS, it's always there, done by Apple. It's an Apple app. Pretty straightforward. So, but how it can be seen by some visually impaired user is like this. So we don't see much, right? Like, everything is blurred, and for some users, this can be the norm. But what can be done with an existing functionality on iOS, and that also exists on other platforms, is to enable dynamic type. So our calendar app now with bigger text looks like this. So dynamic text enables that, like, the user will choose a font size he prefers, and then the app will correctly respond to that, to this preference. So in this case here, to enable bigger text size. And as a result, we can see there's a huge improvement with our example of before, like in readability. Like if you have presbyopia, for example, this is really so much better. So of course, this is only one example, and there's so many more examples of this, but it helps us understand like what is accessibility, and like it's to make your app accessible for all of your users. But it's not just about making our app works for people with disabilities. It's really about allowing all customers to experience our app in a way that they are the most comfortable with. Accessibility features, when they are enabled in your app, empower your users to personalize like how they interact with it in a way that works for them, because there's no one size fits all. So we might think that it's a minority of users that uses those features and that there's not that many, but here's a crazy stat. Like, it's 1 in 7 people worldwide that have a disability or impairment that affects the way they interact with their devices, whether it be permanent or temporary. When I'm not put in another way, that's 14% of your users. And to me, that's huge. Like, it's not 1%, it's 14, and it matters. So you might wonder, like, is there some accessibility standard that needs to be applied on mobile for a native app, or is there something that exists for that? It's like on iOS, there's what we call the Human Interface Guideline, which is the logo. For accessibility, that's the logo. And yeah, it has a section. Human Interface Guideline has a section for accessibility. So the guidelines, those guidelines give developer, like designers or anyone working on the app, some direction on how to give everyone a great user experience. Something also good to know, there are documents provided by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, but they're only for informative guidance on mobile and do not set requirements as of yet. Like that's something that could come in the future. Recently, Ontario has passed a regulation called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. It's a law that sets out a process for developing and enforcing accessibility standards. So the focus is currently on web and web-based mobile app, but it's not crazy to think that it's something that could come in the future for native apps at some point. So good to keep in mind. And now let's see what exists on iOS for accessibility features. So there's built-in accessibility features and APIs to help us enable those features. And there's different categories that exist for those features. So we'll quickly go over them with some example of what it can help users with. Let's start with the first one, vision. So for vision accessibility features, voiceover can be enabled, as well as different display accommodations such as like color inversion, larger text, zoom, magnifier, contrast, transparency, and blurring, or it can also be disabling or reducing animations. We won't cover them all today, like there's a lot. We'll cover some of them a little bit more into details, but again, I guess to give you an idea of what exists. So all those vision accessibility features can help people with color blindness, any forms of vision loss, or anything really that makes seeing a screen uncomfortable or difficult. For hearing accessibility features, we might think right away about like hearing loss, but like let's think that it could also help users, for example, that wouldn't want his device to make sound, or like, I don't know, in a place like a theater or something. Another example could be a user that prefer to listen to videos with closed captioning instead of hearing the sound. And I have to say, I'm one of those users. I like closed captioning. Like I don't like, sometimes I just don't want to listen to the sound of the video that's playing. I don't know, it happens. So there's, like I just said, like closed captioning possible for hearing accessibility features, but also visual and haptic notification can be done, so it's there instead of sound. There's also type to see remote that can be possible. So those are all the possibilities. For physical and motor, this category provides different accommodations to help people use their devices. So there's things like switch controls that to enable navigation on an app with an external device. So it can be with a button click, blowing, blinking, or any alternative inputs. There's also Siri that you can use to control your app and the device. And there's also assistive touch with some standard gestures. So people that have a difficulty holding or manipulating their devices can beneficiate from that. And last but not least, we're finishing with literacy and learning. Literacy and learning challenges can include difficulty speaking, reading, managing complexity, staying focused. So to help with literacy and learning challenges, Apple provide features like speak screen, typing feedback, Safari Reader. So yeah, so that's it. So this covers the big categories that exist for those features. So now that you're all convinced that accessibility is something important that needs to be implemented in your app, and that we have now a better idea of what exists in iOS, like where do we start? Like where do we go from here? So let's first see the development tools of a perfect iOS developer. And then we'll go with some usage examples of accessibility features. Let's start with Interface Builder. So on iOS, there's multiple ways to create UI. One of them is using Interface Builder. It's available with Xcode, like it's built in. And what we see here is part of this Interface Builder tool to access the accessibility options on a UI label. UI label is a base class provided by Apple to display one or more lines of text. There's different ways, but that's one of them. It's all customizable. And there's, of course, other classes and view provided by Apple to build a user interface, like a UI button, UI text field, etc. And what is nice is that a lot of them are accessible by default. The difference between them is that they have different accessibility threats, which then tells the assistive application how the element should behave or should be treated. So I said accessible by default. I meant accessible by default with like voiceover. Like that's the, at least with voiceover, it's always enabled. So there's accessibility threats, but what also other than that is configurable in there. So we see here, like first row or something like that. We can see that we can disable accessibility. Like if we don't want it to be enabled on some UI elements, we can change the label. So the label is what is read out loud to the user with voiceover. You can also add an int. An int is there like to provide more context to the user instead, like for example, if you have an action and on the action you want more context on it, like what does the action do, etc. Like you can put a hint for that. And there's also the identifier. Identifier is useful to retrieve UI elements for UI testing or like automation. If your QA will ask you for that if they have some automation going on. So yeah, that's useful to know. And all those accessibility settings can also be configured, of course, from code. Next, in the toolbox of an iOS developer, you have the accessibility inspector. It's useful to test the accessibility. It uses the same APIs accessibility clients use to get information from accessible object it encounters. So something that I really appreciate from the accessibility inspector is its ability to do voiceover and navigate the app with it, which is not possible through a simulator. Otherwise, you have to use a real device. So what I'm showing you here in the GIF is what it looks like to inspect some elements in an app to get their accessibility properties. And sometimes to debug accessibility, you have to dig a little deeper. And maybe accessibility was disabled on an element that shouldn't, and VoiceOver is not working. Or maybe you want VoiceOver to ignore some icons in the view because they don't provide context to the user and they shouldn't be read when VoiceOver goes through the items. Or maybe you want to group some elements together so they are read back to back to provide a more like streamlined experience to the user so that he doesn't have to select the next one. And somehow, well, it's not working. So if that happens, debug view hierarchy is super useful. It can be used for many other things, of course, but that's one of the usage. You can inspect each element and see what is its accessibility settings, so whether it's accessible or not. Last useful tool we'll cover today is the environment overrides. So we talked a lot about VoiceOver, but what if we want to test some visual accessibility features like the one we saw, like dynamic type, contrast, bold text, dark mode, reduce motion, all the ones that are listed right there. So it's possible to go to the iOS settings and enable them there, but you know, like it takes, if you're a developer, you want to go quick. It takes a long time, like to each time go into the settings, enable, disable, like run your app, and it's too long. So yeah, that exists, like the environment overrides accessible. It's possible to do it like from starting from iOS 13, if I'm not mistaken. So it's possible to make your app react to accessibility features inside the simulator. So it's super quickly, you can change the size and everything. So really, really useful when you're developing. So we've seen tools that can be used to enable, debug, and test accessibility. Now let's cover some accessibility features a little more into details. Let's have a look first at reduce motion accessibility setting. So for some users, animations can be either distracting, hard to follow, or give rise to problems of balance or even nausea. So the trigger for that can vary. It can be like scaling, zooming, spinning, and like vortex, or multi-speed motion, multi-directional, or really any other type of movement. And by default, there's a lot of animation in UIKit, like screens transitioning, zoom or sliding effects, parallax effects, which happen, for example, when you have your phone and then you look at your background on your account, and then you tilt it and the image shifts slightly, so that's parallax. And of course, like there's also custom animations in the developer in different apps that the developer implements themselves. So if you have a sensitivity to motion, you can enable an option in the iOS settings to reduce motion. This setting disables many animation and parallax effects that are there in iOS by default. But the thing is that it doesn't disable custom animations that developers do and implement in their app. So to react to this setting in an app, like first, like if you work with designers, designers have to think of variations in animation. Like what is the solution like there? Like should the animation be reduced? Should it be disabled? What is the solution? And then the developer can adjust in the code by looking at the is reduced motion enabled boolean. So we know if the user enabled it or not. And then we can test this feature with the environment overrides that is available in Xcode, as we have seen. Because otherwise, maybe we think we have the coolest of all the animation in the world, but if for some of your users, like who enable the reduce motion settings, like, and they end up like with an animation that looks like this, like if they throw up their breakfast, like is it really that cool of an animation? Like I don't think so. So that's something to consider. Now let's jump onto dynamic type. So we've seen it a little bit at the beginning of this presentation. Dynamic type enables your user to choose the size of the content displayed on the screen, so which font size he prefers. Then the app will correctly adjust to that chosen size. One thing to think about is the apps that support dynamic type also provide a more like consistent reading experience, since, well, in the Apple environment, all of their apps react to dynamic type. So if your app reacts to this, then it's all consistent inside this ecosystem. And as you can see here, like it's really easy for the user to enable. Like it's just a slider, he can choose the text size he wants. So for the user, it's pretty straightforward to enable. On the development side, there's two ways to enable dynamic type, since it's not something that is enabled by default. Here we see how you can do it inside the interface builder. So you select which font text style you want, and you check mark like dynamic type automatically adjust fonts, and then your label, your UI label, is gonna react to it. And you can also do that from code, of course, so it's doing the same thing as in Interface Builder. It's just sometimes a little bit more customization can be necessary if you have some dynamic elements in there, etc. Or if you have custom fonts, anything really. So yeah, so you might wonder, like, why is it not something that's enabled by default? Like voiceover is something that is enabled by default, for example, when you implement a label inside your app. So why is it not resizing automatically? And their answer is because it can get complicated. Like, it depends on the UI you have, and there's a lot of if. One thing to consider is like whenever you put like you enable dynamic type inside your app, like it needs to have a scroll view inside, like somewhere inside the view hierarchy, because otherwise you cannot guarantee that the content will be properly displayed, since it can grow in text size. As you can see there on the right, like if there's no scroll view, the user cannot access the content that is further on the bottom. Height of element is also something to consider, since it's dynamic. So if your label is inside, like if it's normally there's normally like some type of containers, and the height of this container needs to adjust. Like it cannot be fixed like in any way. It needs to adjust, and so this can normally be enabled through like a constraint. But sometimes there are some exceptions, and constraints are not enough. Like you have to come up with some sort of other solutions. And we can see here an example of height on table views that are automatically adjusting in the iOS settings. Another thing to consider is if you have horizontally aligned text, as we see here, like on the first case, like up there, the text doesn't work on multiple lines, so it becomes unreadable. On the second case, it's the label, like it's wrapping on multiple lines, but the width of the label makes it hard to read, and it's like it looks weird. And the third row is perfect. So in this case, like we pass from a horizontally alignment for the label to a vertical one to allow for the text even like with this width, so it can be so all of the text can be read properly. So maybe you have to look for like a certain size threshold and then adjust the UI accordingly. And yeah, of course, like sometimes you encounter issues while trying to make your app work with dynamic type or other accessibility features in general. But whenever there's an issue, like there's always a solution. Like just as long as everyone that's working on the app, like developer, PO, BA, designers, like talk and work together, so then it can be properly managed and implemented. Like there's always a solution for any situations. Because accessibility is everyone's responsibility. It's not just the developer, it's not just the designers, it's like it's everyone together. Like everyone needs to work on it with a mindset like striving to do better. Accessibility is a human-centric topic, so we have to ask questions so we can continuously improve. It's not always straightforward to implement, but in the long term, it can only help your users. So I hope you enjoyed this tech session and that you learned something today. I'll be in the chat with some of my colleagues from Intact Lab, so if you have any questions, feel free to write in the chat. Thank you.